They were wearing the wrong boots. That is what gave them away. 3 men in olive drab, riding a jeep through the gray Belgian dawn of December 17, 1944. American uniforms, American vehicle, American dog tags around their necks, with names like Charles W. Lawrence and Clarence van der Wert stamped into the metal. They spoke English. They answered questions at the checkpoint with a steady American drawl. But when the military police asked for the password, the 3 men hesitated just long enough. One wrong syllable, one uncertain glance between them. The MPs pulled them out of the jeep at gunpoint. Underneath the American overcoats, the men were wearing the uniforms of the German Wehrmacht. Their names were Manfred Pernas, Günther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt. They were soldiers of the Waffen-SS, part of Adolf Hitler's most ambitious and desperate deception of the entire war. And what happened to them in the days that followed would send a tremor of fear through every soldier on both sides of the Western Front, from the frozen ridges of the Ardennes all the way to the high command bunkers where generals plotted by candlelight. This is the story of Operation Greif, the plan that sent Germans dressed as dead Americans behind Allied lines, and the fury it unleashed in one of history's most volatile and consequential commanders. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe now. We tell the real stories of the men who fought, the decisions that shaped the war, and the history that still matters today. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode. To understand what made Operation Greif so extraordinary and so dangerous, you have to understand the moment in which it was conceived. By the autumn of 1944, Germany was losing. The Allied breakout from Normandy had swept across France at a pace that shocked even Patton. Paris had been liberated. The Wehrmacht was bleeding out on 2 fronts. The Red Army was grinding westward through Poland. The Reich was shrinking. And Adolf Hitler, isolated in his underground headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, was preparing one final roll of the dice. He called it the Ardennes counteroffensive. His generals would later call it madness. History would call it the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious in its scale. 3 German armies, more than 250,000 men, their last armored reserves, would crash through a lightly defended sector of the American front in Belgium and Luxembourg, split the Allied lines in 2, race to the port of Antwerp, and cut off British and American supply lines entirely. If it worked, Hitler believed, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate everything against the Soviets. His senior generals knew the plan had almost no chance of success, but no one dared say so. And while the Wehrmacht assembled in the frozen forests, Hitler summoned a man he trusted above almost all others for a special task within the larger task. His name was Otto Skorzeny. By the fall of 1944, Skorzeny was already the most famous commando in the world, or at least the most famous commando in Nazi propaganda. He was Austrian-born, a Waffen-SS colonel with a long scar running down the left side of his face from a student duel in Vienna. The scar had earned him a nickname, Scarface. The Germans called him something else, the most dangerous man in Europe. He had earned that title the previous year, when he personally led a raid on a mountaintop hotel in Italy where Benito Mussolini was being held prisoner after the Italian armistice, plucked the fallen dictator from his captors, and flew him to freedom in a tiny Fieseler Stork aircraft. It was exactly the kind of theatrical, improbable mission that Hitler loved. Now in October 1944, Hitler briefed Skorzeny on an assignment he described as the most important of the commando's life. The plan was simple in concept and staggering in ambition. Skorzeny would form a special brigade, Panzergrenadier Brigade 150, composed of English-speaking German soldiers dressed in captured American uniforms, driving captured American jeeps and vehicles. They would infiltrate Allied lines in the chaos of the opening assault, race ahead of the German armored spearheads, and seize intact the bridges over the Moose River before American engineers could blow them. With the bridges held, the panzer divisions could pour westward unimpeded. But that was only the operational objective. The psychological objective was something far more corrosive. By proving that German soldiers could move freely behind American lines, wearing American uniforms, driving American vehicles, by making every checkpoint, every crossroads, every quiet American village potentially harbor an enemy in disguise. Skorzeny hoped to shatter the confidence and cohesion of the entire Allied rear, to make every American soldier doubt the man standing next to him. Hitler granted Skorzeny unlimited authority and resources. In theory. In practice, the operation was plagued from the start. Skorzeny needed thousands of English speakers. He got a few hundred, most of whom could barely manage a passable accent. He sent some of them to prisoner of war camps holding captured Americans, hoping they could brush up on the language, a decision that would later haunt the operation's survivors. He needed Sherman tanks, American armored cars, American jeeps by the score. He ended up with a handful of the real thing and a fleet of hastily modified German vehicles painted with American stars, disguises that would fool no one in daylight from any distance. He needed American uniforms. This was perhaps the darkest element of what he was building. The uniforms came from multiple sources, from supply dumps, from battlefield dead, from prisoners of war. When Skorzeny's procurement officers sent orders to POW camp commandants to strip captured American soldiers of their uniforms in the middle of a Belgian winter, a number of those German officers refused, citing the Geneva Convention. Some of the uniforms that arrived bore bloodstains. Others had POW markings that had to be carefully removed. Skorzeny understood perfectly well what capture meant for his men. The Hague Convention of 1907 was explicit. Soldiers caught behind enemy lines in enemy uniforms forfeited their rights as prisoners of war. They could be executed as spies. He briefed his commandos accordingly. The men who volunteered for Einheitsstielau, the Corps infiltration unit, did so knowing that the price of failure was a firing squad. In the end, only about 44 men actually crossed into American lines in disguise. They were organized into small teams with specific missions: cut telephone lines, reverse road signs, misdirect convoys, report enemy positions. A few were tasked with something more audacious, driving ahead of the German advance and holding critical bridges just long enough for the tanks to arrive. On the bitterly cold pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944, the Ardennes offensive began. More than 1,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, tearing through the frozen darkness. 2 American divisions, green, thinly spread with no warning, were hit by the full weight of the assault. The front line buckled and in places collapsed entirely. GIs were captured in their foxholes, overrun before they could fire a shot. The word spread fast and terrible. The Germans had broken through. Skorzeny's commandos slipped into the chaos. In those first hours and days, Einheitsstielau operated with a boldness that seems almost unbelievable in retrospect. One small team drove into an American-held town, surveyed the defenses, noted the positions of fuel and ammunition dumps, and drove back out again, waved through by American soldiers who saw nothing but familiar uniforms and a familiar jeep. Another team redirected an entire regiment down the wrong road, costing hours of critical movement. Communications between General Omar Bradley's headquarters and 1st Army Command were cut. Road signs were reversed. Convoys idled at crossroads where their orders suddenly made no sense. The damage they did on the ground was real, but the damage they did to American morale was far greater. Word spread through the Allied rear with the speed and distortion of a rumor in wartime. There were Germans everywhere in American uniforms. They were assassinating officers. They were poisoning water supplies. They were signaling German aircraft to bomb American headquarters. The stories multiplied and fed on each other until they bore almost no resemblance to what 44 men with jeeps and reversible overcoats could actually accomplish. And then came Manfred Pernass, Günther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt. The 3-man team captured at Eylau on December 17th had done nothing more dramatic than fail a password check. But under interrogation, one of them, accounts vary on which, said something that detonated like a bomb inside Allied intelligence. He said that Otto Skorzeny himself intended to capture General Dwight Eisenhower. It almost certainly was not true. There is no credible evidence that any assassination or kidnapping plot against Eisenhower was ever part of the actual operational orders for Greif. But in the paranoid atmosphere of December 1944, With the front lines dissolving and German infiltrators confirmed behind Allied lines, the Americans were more than willing to believe it. Eisenhower was placed under effective house arrest. His chief of security doubled and then tripled the guard on his headquarters at Versailles. The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe was confined to his own offices for Christmas 1944, furious and increasingly impatient. He finally emerged after several days, reportedly declaring that he didn't care if anyone tried to kill him. He had to get out. At every checkpoint across the Allied rear, American soldiers began devising new ways to catch German infiltrators. The standard password and countersign were no longer enough. Now soldiers asked questions that they felt only a real American would know. Who plays shortstop for the Yankees? What city is the Cardinals' home? What is the capital of Illinois? Even those questions became unreliable. General Omar Bradley himself was temporarily detained at a checkpoint when he identified the capital of Illinois as Chicago rather than Springfield. The American general was released when the military police decided, on balance, that he was probably not a German spy. George Patton, characteristically, found the whole business less amusing than most. Patton had learned of the German offensive on December 16th, the same day it began. He was at his headquarters in Nancy, France, when the phone calls started arriving from a shaken Allied high command. The news was bad and getting worse by the hour. German armor deep into Belgium, 2 divisions shattered, a bulge punching through the center of the Allied line. 2 days later, on December 19th, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders at Verdun. The atmosphere in the room was, by most accounts, one of controlled alarm. Eisenhower wanted solutions, not panic. He looked around the table and asked who could mount a counterattack to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne, a critical road junction now surrounded by German forces, and how quickly. Patton told Eisenhower he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went quiet. His staff had already worked through the contingency. Before the Verdun conference, Patton had given his operations officers 3 code words, each corresponding to a different axis of advance. When he called back from Verdun, he simply said the word, and the Third Army was already in motion. It was, by almost any measure, the most remarkable feat of staff planning and command flexibility in the history of the American Army. But as the Third Army began its massive 90-degree pivot, turning hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles northward through winter roads in a matter of hours, Patton was also dealing with the threat that Skorzeny's men posed to his own command. The general had no patience for the atmosphere of paranoia that Operation Greif had seeded through the Allied rear. He understood it, and he despised it. German soldiers in American uniforms were not a strategic threat to the outcome of the Bulge. Patton understood that clearly enough. They were a nuisance, a psychological weapon, and a violation of the laws of war that he had lived by his entire military life. Patton's response to the infiltrator threat was characteristically direct. His provost marshal units were ordered to treat any soldier who could not properly identify himself as a potential enemy combatant. Checkpoints were reinforced. Units were instructed to verify the identity of anyone whose behavior seemed inconsistent with their claimed assignment. And the general made clear, in the language that his subordinates had come to expect, that German soldiers found in American uniforms would be dealt with according to the laws of war, which meant, in practice, that they would face a firing squad. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the law of armed conflict, applied without hesitation by a general who believed that war had rules, precisely because those rules were what separated soldiers from murderers. You did not wear the enemy's uniform behind his lines, not because it was dishonest in some abstract sense, but because it destroyed the basic condition that made civilized warfare possible: the ability of soldiers to know who they were fighting. When that was gone, as it was on those December roads in Belgium, every man in American olive drab became a potential target, and every checkpoint became a potential ambush. The fury that Patton felt was not theatrical, it was moral. Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt were tried by a military commission at Henry Chapelle on December 21, 1944, 4 days after their capture. The proceedings were swift, and the evidence was plain. The commission found all three guilty on 2 counts: violation of the laws of war by appearing in American uniforms in the zone of operations, and acting as spies by gathering intelligence while so disguised. The recommended penalty was death. The review was conducted the following day by Colonel E.M. Brannan of the Staff Judge Advocate's Office, who upheld the findings. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commander of 1st United States Army, approved and confirmed the sentences that same afternoon. On the morning of December 23, 1944, 2 days before Christmas, Pernass, Billing, and Schmidt were brought to the execution ground of the 482nd Military Police Guard Station. They had refused the ministrations of an American chaplain. According to witnesses, they kept their composure to the end, singing German patriotic songs as they were tied to the stakes and blindfolded. A firing squad of 24 military policemen carried out the sentence. An officer checked to confirm the men were dead. They were not the last. Over the following weeks, as more Greif commandos were captured, the executions continued. 13 more men shot at Henri Chapelle or at Houghton. And finally, in June 1945, the unit's leader, Gunther Schultz, tried and executed by the American Ninth Army near Braunschweig. In total, at least 17 men were confirmed to have been caught and executed for their participation in Operation Greif. Skorzeny himself was not among them. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and spent 2 years in prison awaiting trial. When his case finally came before the military tribunal at Dachau in 1947, the proceedings took an unexpected turn. His American-appointed defense attorney, Colonel Robert Durst, mounted a vigorous argument that the Hague Convention's prohibition on enemy uniforms applied only to actual combat while so disguised, not to infiltration and reconnaissance. Skorzeny pointed out, not unreasonably, that Allied soldiers had themselves used German uniforms on multiple occasions. The most dramatic moment came when a surprise witness appeared for the defense. Wing Commander Forrest Yo Thomas of the Royal Air Force, a former British SOE agent known to German intelligence as the White Rabbit, who had himself escaped German captivity partly by disguising himself in enemy uniforms. Yo Thomas argued that what Skorzeny had done was no different from standard Allied practice in special operations. The tribunal was persuaded. Skorzeny and his officers were acquitted. He would go on to live until 1975, aging in Madrid, trading on his wartime reputation, and remaining a figure of fascination and controversy until the end. The men he had sent across the lines, the ones who did not come home, were given no such second act. On December 26, 1944, 3 days after the Henri Chapelle executions, and on Christmas Day by some calendars adjusted for the time, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The corridor they opened was narrow and desperately contested, but it held. The 101st Airborne, surrounded for 9 days, was no longer alone. The Battle of the Bulge would grind on until late January 1945. 6 more weeks of some of the most brutal combat of the Western War, fought in temperatures that plunged well below zero, across a landscape that seemed designed to kill men as efficiently as the weapons they carried. But the crisis moment had passed. The deepest German penetration had been contained. The Bulge would be slowly, painfully compressed, and then erased. Operation Greif had achieved its psychological objective with remarkable efficiency for those first desperate days. The paranoia it seeded, the confusion it planted, the hours it cost the Allied response. But as a military operation, it had failed completely. Not a single Moose bridge was captured. Not one of the modified German tanks disguised as American M10 tank destroyers survived the battle. The Jeep teams had misdirected a few convoys, cut a few telephone lines, reversed a few signs. Against the weight of what Patton's army accomplished in those same weeks, it was a footnote written in the wrong ink. What it did demonstrate, with cold clarity, was something that Patton had understood his entire career. That war has laws not because the powerful choose to follow them, but because the alternative, the world in which a soldier cannot tell friend from enemy, in which every uniform is a potential lie, is a world in which no order is possible and no mercy survives. The men of Einheitsstielau were not cowards. They volunteered knowing the price of failure. They crossed into enemy lines in the middle of one of the most violent battles of the European War, wearing stolen dead men's uniforms, carrying false identities, prepared to die for a cause that was already dying around them. They were soldiers in a desperate army making a desperate gamble on the orders of a desperate man. But the law did not distinguish between desperate and deliberate. It distinguished between lawful and unlawful. And when American military police pulled 3 men from a jeep on a Belgian road because they failed a password check, the law ran its course with the same cold efficiency that it always had. George Patton never needed to be present at an execution to deliver a verdict. The Third Army's response to Operation Greif was not a moment of cruelty or revenge. It was a statement, made in the language that all armies understand, the language of consequence. There are lines in war that, once crossed, do not lead back. Wearing a dead man's uniform is one of them. Not because the dead man's honor demands it, though perhaps it does, but because the living, the men at the checkpoints, the drivers at the crossroads, the soldiers in the foxholes who now had to look twice at every face that approached them in olive drab, deserve to know who is coming. Patton understood this not as doctrine but as instinct. He had spent his life studying war, its history, its tactics, its laws, its costs. He knew that the rules which governed armed conflict were not the rules of gentlemen pretending that violence was something other than what it was. They were the rules that made it possible to stop. You could take a man's life in war. You could not take his identity. When Patton found Germans wearing dead GIs' uniforms, he did what the law required and what his conscience demanded. He made sure they would not do it again. In the winter of 1944, with the snow falling on the Ardennes and the Third Army driving north into history, that was enough. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that the real history of the men who fought deserves to be told with accuracy and respect, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who would want to know it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and ring that bell so you're here for the next episode. The history is real. It always is, and it always matters.